Good. All right, so getting started on this topic, asset template guides. This is something that Tim and I came up with, and it was about 2 years ago while we were working together at Resource. And the idea was just really how developers and designers could be working together, as well as really trying to focus on expanding creative assets and content on the website and making graphics kind of take up as much space as possible. So it's a combination of different things that Tim and I have come across, but it was really about focusing on the marketing side of websites and how you could layer different content, both text-wise with imagery on a site. So anything else that you want to add on that as well?
No, I think that kind of gets it started.
Yeah, and also this presentation Tim and I started putting together literally over 1.5 years ago, and we never finished it. And then, so it was kind of fun for us to put this back together and revisit this topic. And we've been talking about writing actually a blog post on this. So if you guys have feedback, please let us know on this.
Yeah.
So cool.
All right, so asset template guides sound just like a bunch of words put together, but it'll probably make a little bit more sense, hopefully, as we're going through this. So as Ryan was stating, we were starting to try to look at, as we're doing more responsive projects, how we could allow both designers and developers to collaborate a little bit more. And just looking at the responsive process as a whole, starting to find that there's a lot of pitfalls we kept falling under. So starting to look for tools and collaboration methods that would allow us to get around some of these issues. So what the Asset Template Guide does is it really addresses 3 problems. The first problem is around predicting the reflow of content in a responsive environment. So a lot of the discussion we had around responsive was all about content, and really content on the web in general. I think that's kind of one of the pieces that's often overlooked for websites. Like everyone's always looking for a redesign, wanting it to have a lot of new functionality, but forget the fact that it's really content that's driving a site, and that's why people are there. So really starting with content is very key, and then how does that content work within the context of the site? So making sure that that's kind of on top of mind. And the Asset Template Guide will help predict that reflow of this content. Second of all, giving designers more creative freedom when designing for responsive. So something that we were coming across as we were doing more responsive projects was that responsive sites were, at that time at least, and still to this day, are often seem very obvious in regards to how some of the design challenges are met. A lot of times things are in boxes that end up stacking. It just makes everything seem very modular, so how could we get around that? How could we give the designer a little bit more freedom as to how the space that they're working in? So we started looking at different ways of allowing for that to happen with not only the content or the data from the first point, but as well as imagery as a whole. Then lastly, just straight up communication between developer and designer, especially around image restrictions in the digital landscape. So a big thing with responsive is that it really started to point out the fact that just the overall website process was somewhat broken, and that a lot of the designers were designing in a vacuum, the developers were developing in a vacuum, and there wasn't a lot of communication in some of these initial pieces of the process. So responsive helped identify that issue, but then how do you communicate a lot of these initial steps? How do you communicate how this content's being flowed and the design is going to scale from different devices and different resolutions? And so we started talking about the digital landscape, which is really those different resolutions and devices. So as you're going from like a small screen to a wide screen, how are things being able to evolve for those different aspect ratios and whatnot, and still look elegant, still allow the content to be legible, and just be an overall good experience throughout. So the idea of the Asset Template Guide was really inspired by print design. And I think Kevin just kind of came up with an analogy or saw one of the templates that you typically use for creating a print piece before sending it to the printer. And he started realizing that a lot of these concepts are actually very similar to how we could potentially look at development on the web.
I actually got started off, one of my first jobs was being a print designer, and I primarily did newspaper ads, and then I also made a lot of band art and different album covers. So that's kind of the breakdown of everything here. Then, of course, once I started working with the web, it kind of triggered a moment when I looked at like the landscape and trying to create something from small devices, large devices. There's a lot of guess and check type deal, and that's where kind of those 3 points kind of hit on that Tim just talked about. I think you called me Ryan earlier.
What?
Did you call me Ryan earlier?
Yeah, I think so. Did I? Ryan.
That's funny.
Yeah. So kind of the first piece of the idea of bringing print into this idea of the asset template guide is bleed and trim marks. So in the print world, bleed and trim marks allow you to have an intended crop while giving you freedom to bleed off the page. So really what that's saying is in a lot of print pieces you just take for granted that the image is bleeding off the actual sheet of paper, but that's actually somewhat of a complicated printing technique. A lot of times if you see that there's always an edge, say like on your home printer, that's because you aren't given the luxury of being able to do bleed. So we're looking at how we can bring that concept into design, web design. So that starts looking at, opposed to always and responsive, typically having a lot of the content stuck in square containers, how can we start allowing a lot of the images or the actual text and content to bleed from those edges? So in a typical print template, this is one that we just pulled off the web. A lot of times you'll get something like this that you'll pull into InDesign or Illustrator or however you're actually setting up the print piece to send off to the printer. And they typically define all these things for you. You'll get this actually from a printer, but it'll have these preset lines illustrating the bleed marks, the trim line, and most importantly, the safety area. So all the content that's important, all text, anything that you want to make sure is evident to the end user or the person that's viewing it, needs to be within that safety region.
Yeah. And again, this is just something, it is a full guide for a designer because without this, you're designing an actual CD, you would have no idea where to start. You'd be like a square, and you wouldn't know where that circle is, the clear plastic, and where those edges are. You'd just be blindly guessing.
And a lot of times designers would just kind of guess if they were not using this template. And if the printer was not gracious, they might just print it off and you'd spend a bunch of money to get a product that ends up having a lot of the content cut off. The image might not crop how you intended. Some really relevant type might be like literally cut off the page. So this helps ensure that all your intended design is represented how you're hoping.
Are you going to talk about translating that into
Yep.
HTML?
Yeah,
That's what
so
we're building up to.
Yeah.
Okay.
So similar to what we're just looking at, that's where we came up with this asset template guide, getting into how we actually can bring this to life in the digital space. So the actual asset template guide ensures the content will be displayed correctly across all digital landscapes. So similar to what we were just looking at with the print template, when we had our safe area, we want to make sure that no matter what the resolution is, no matter what the device is, that the content that's most important and the intentions of the designer are always displayed as optimal as possible. So looking at the digital landscape, once again, just to clarify, that's the viewports creating a trim line, crop marks, safe, and bleed zones. So as we're going across this landscape, we're also starting to look at on both a PSD deliverable that the designer would work off of, as well as in the actual code, how do we start representing these things so that we can have a little bit more of that freedom.
And again, just hitting on, and Tim mentioned this earlier, but everything with the design and digital landscape is making sure it always looks right no matter what the form factor is or the device the user is using. Especially when it comes to visual design elements, you want it to look perfect wherever it is. And I'm not trying to use the word perfect loosely because I get obsessive about every single pixel, every single point on a responsive site.
Yeah. And I think there was a lot of debate for a while about being pixel perfect on responsive sites. And though it might not be pixel perfect, being that a lot of the content is flowing, this allows you to be able to make sure that all your visual and design intentions are represented. So now we're going to kind of run through how this would work in regards to more of the process. So the designer and the developer need to define these structures together. So what we're saying is when we're referring to structures, like where does this content live? What are these containers? What is the flexibility around how images and content can work together in tangent? So there's a series of kind of steps we've helped define that will ensure that this would actually work. So the first one is evaluating the content. So I started off talking about how important content is, and the earlier you can define that content and know pretty much what that content would be, the better, so that you can design for it. It's really hard to design content without actually knowing the content. And when we're referring to the team, we don't just mean the designers and the developers. We're talking about the larger team. So if you have stakeholders, if you have copywriters, BAs, AIs, like everybody should potentially be involved with this initial discussion around content so you know what you're designing for. The second is just creating a layout concept. So this can be all different fidelities and all different applications or sketches or whatever the medium the designer chooses to use, starting to look at what these layouts could potentially be. And then moving on, starting to look at how the developer can create structure for the content. So these two can actually kind of start happening in tangent. The designer can start looking at layout concepts while the developer, with potentially having the designer have a little bit of time in advance to get some of these initial ideas out there, the developer can start creating these structural content. So that allows them to kind of work together while being able to affect each other's work as the concept starts flushing out.
Yeah, and so the concepts are really, they're part of the deliverable, but they're not the final deliverable. I always want to stress that. Like, when anyone's handing off a PSD, it's really just a step in an iterative process. It is the idea of where the design is going. It is not the final piece. The true evolution of the design and the true evolution of the design happens in the browser, and it happens with refinements and different iterations of making sure that the content and the design kind of matches the need of the requirements as well as like the overall user experience. But they're definitely from step 2 to 3, they are derived from each other. But the big point with like 3, especially talking about asset template guides, there's 2 different ways to look at containers and designing around content. There's containers for content and content containers, which sounds like pretty much the same thing, but containers for content as opposed to content containers are you set requirements on them. So in the case of looking at one of them, I know my design requires me to have no more than 200 characters, no more than 30 words. In the other one, I've created a flexible container that the content can flow and expand in any which way. So that's its own topic, containers and content.
So once this overall structure and the general layout concepts are created, then moves us just into collaboration, displaying content across landscapes. So that's where the asset template guide really comes into play. It allows you to start seeing visibly both in a Photoshop document as well as in the web how these pieces of content are going to scale. And once you start actually bringing in a lot of this content, you can start setting maximums and minimums around content, so sizing restraints around images, when you're talking about actual text, how much word count you potentially have, so this way it gives you a little bit of an idea of how things will flex as they're going from different viewports.
So that's once for each size you're dealing with then? I mean, how?
It's per structure and module.
Yeah, you'll kind of see how that actually plays out in the next couple slides. We'll show not only a Photoshop document, but how it scales to the web and how those two documents come together.
And in the sense of like you're creating a modular pattern, so individual pieces that are coming together, these containers for the content need to have limitations that you're setting, because as we go through some of the examples, it will kind of make sense, and I'll be hitting on that through the demo. But you kind of need to define those in there by per structure basis.
And thinking about the structures and your max mins, there's going to be times when there's going to be a case where you might need a specific additional spacing for text or some sort of version of it that would allow for different images or way that images are being displayed. So this is where we start looking at these modified versions. So you potentially have different versions for specific modules. So the deliverable, or what the template that the actual designer are using, is a Photoshop document that's derived directly from the code. So once these structures are created, the developer will create a series of containers that are color-coded that we then will take screenshots of at specific breakpoints to then create this Photoshop document. And that allows you, with that on top of adding smart objects, being able to see how things are scaling between different resolutions on a single Photoshop document.
And again, we'll be showing an example of this.
So here's a potential background image we could be looking at for a site or a component of a site. And when we're going to be, the example we're going to be showing within both the Photoshop document and the HTML, we'll start defining some of these areas. So we're color coding what the potential bleed area would be. And then once again, layering on top the crop mark. So this is the area that would potentially be cropped depending on the different aspect ratio or resolution that you'd be looking at. And then most importantly, the safety zone. So the area that you know is always going to be safe for that most important content. So this is the section that you always want to be playing with and making sure that everything works regardless of the resolution, regardless of the device. Wherever you are within the digital landscape, this is the area that you have to work with safely, that it's not going to be cropped in any way.
Can I switch sides with you just so I can see what the video's in? So then the last one is really this trim zone, which is the overall image as a whole. So this is actually an image. So it's a PNG that I put on a white background just so you could see it. In the case of this demo, it's going to be transparent. But here is kind of doing a quick introduction to what the demo is. We're going to talk about two different sections and how content is layering on top of this image. So in the case of this guy, and these are made per structure that you have or per zone. So in the case of this example, there's going to be a layering effect that happens of the content where it's layering on top of this image, and at different at different viewports, the bottom's going to be cut off, or the top's going to be cut off, or the left's going to be cut off. So as we look at this, the one part that's always consistent and where no matter what resolution you are, even if you're at 100 pixels, you're always going to see this green piece. If your browser is 26,000 pixels wide, you're always going to see this. So no matter what, you will always see this green. Certain landscapes, you won't see that blue. And in certain landscapes, the yellow will have content on top of it. And when it comes to the yellow content, it still means you can design on top of it, but you want to be looking at like your contrast ratio. So if your image here is kind of dark, say it's black, maybe we can have white text on top of it. That would be completely acceptable. But the yellow area is more for like fluff, additional enhancements around the images. But by just looking at this and looking through the demo, you'll be able to see how you can easily design without even having to look at the structures as a whole and placing it into HTML.
Quick comment. I don't know if you ever show this externally, but maybe a different picture work that was focused on.
This is that's just because it's in the exact demo here. So I'll walk through that. So
it just threw me off because I was looking at the screen.
no worries. So here's the actual structure that we have here. So it looks like just the title and 2 paragraphs. But in reality, off to the left over here, there's going to be an image. And I'm just going to show you how this content flows just so you get an understanding of how it actually works. So as it gets smaller, you will see that the content moves from kind of the right to the left. And at the top, there's going to be an image here. But right now, I just want you guys to get familiar with the idea that that content is flowing from right to the bottom, or from bottom to the right. So looking at this, I've added in some lines here. So right here is my max width and min width. So on the far left, you'll see a max width and a min width, so from here to here. And then down here is actually the content zone of the content here. And then over here is an asset that is kind of hidden here. But you can see that they cross boundaries, and this is just pure HTML and I've just outlined it with an outline stroke. So just kind of setting up the next step is this is my base structure that I've created, and this is just purely HTML, my max widths, and two different contents. So two different containers, one on the right, one on the left. One's holding content, one's going to be holding the asset, where one of them is actually layering on top of the other one. So now looking at throwing in an asset template guide, we see that there's this yellow zone. So this guy right here is all an image, but from that blue to this yellow right here is one big image. There's another piece of this image that's being cut off that you'll see as it gets smaller. The green means it's going to be visible anywhere across from small sizes to larger sizes, and this blue is going to get cut off. So that's going to be the first thing that you really notice. But the big important thing is the yellow right here, the text is there, and then the blue. So we'll be watching that as it gets smaller.
It's purple.
It's purple. It's blue on my screen. I think I hit play here, yeah. So notice the blue on the left is getting cut off. So again, that's something that I could design as an accent piece as a whole. I'm still showing a bit of it here, but as it gets smaller, it's going to go completely away. But that green will stop right there. And that yellow still remains to have the text on top of it. So right there, the blue is now gone, but our green is still there. So I've hit that minimum width of kind of this structure as a whole. And now as it gets smaller, my content is, I'm actually doing some CSS trickery to scale my content, but the yellow is still wrapping on top of the text. And now I start seeing from the top and bottom a bit of a blue that's popping up from this image. And now as we get smaller, I reposition that image so you can see that it went up and down. And I'm positioning so that green is always kind of visible no matter what size it is. And you'll notice that that blue from the top and the left and bottom are now always visible. So as I look at the image, back to like those examples, we're going to talk through how you can add in an image to one of these guys. So again, here's it just flowing from small size to largest size. So throwing in this image, and I'm using this as an example of kind of what not to do first, and I'll explain why. So here's this image of this pig, and you saw the quarters, and you saw it got small, and it kind of went off. And I have my text on top of it. This is a pretty common mistake when people are designing. It's almost like you're designing blindly. And why I bring this up is because now you have kind of like a highlighting part of like where you can design around. This is still a wrong design because my content is on top of this piggy bank, as well as if I look at this really closely and look at where this is going to be cropped off, once it gets past this blue, it's going to be a really weird crop of this image right here. So again, just thinking about this holistically as I get from smaller to larger screen sizes. So here, there's that image that's kind of getting cut off. But even though I can't really tell now, as I remove the actual asset template guide, you'll notice that it becomes more noticeable. So in the next step, just removing that layer of that template on top of it, kind of as your guide. And another thing to call out, a lot of people like look at it just at one size here, and they're like, that works. It works really well on mobile. But here it doesn't work well because that content you can't actually read on top of that image. So to me, this is a broken design. It would fail any single accessibility test, and it looks like a responsive site, or it looks like a poor designer did it. So changing up the image to something that will work a little bit better for this case, I'm going to throw in that hand image that we saw earlier holding the phone. So now you can notice that the text, there's really no competing things here as it's centered in the middle. That blue hand is going to go away. So this section is going to go away. When it gets smaller, this is always going to be visible, and we'll see a top and bottom added to this guy. So there goes the hand. That guy becomes visible, and it scales down. Just so you know, when I was putting this image together, besides like the assets for the creation of this image. Just placing it took me about 2 seconds, and I'll also demo how you kind of like move these around. So again, looking at this, here are those highlighting parts. There's the text on top of it, there's the green, there's the blue. Now one thing that you'll notice that doesn't look like a major issue, but it kind of is, because it is to me, is that this finger right here is so close to the text. And you're like, that works really well because I'm looking at the desktop. But there's in-between sizes where that text actually layers on top of it that we're going to fix. Another thing to call out is, if you look at this as it is, it kind of looks like it was meant to be designed that way as a whole. And as we look at additional ones added together and layering them, you'll see that they become kind of more complex. So here's this guy as we get smaller. Pay attention to those 2 fingers and look at where the content is. So right there, that content is layering on top of it. So if I had a device or open up my browser to that size, this would look like a broken design, in my opinion, because it is. Here's what it looks like on mobile. Looks pretty solid, but we notice that this hand's kind of getting cut off. It's a floating hand. That's actually really easy for us to fix because in this design, I've made it so you can add a background color to it. So the next step is to add a background color and also an imagery at the top that kind of matches the overall design for it. So here's what this guy looks like. We still have that image, but we're not going to worry about that right now until we get to the next step. And here's this guy. To be honest, building this was way quicker than me trying to record this. So now we're going to be focusing on making that, adding a second one in there that's kind of the reverse. So we saw that first template before, and now here's the second one and the flowing in there. And we're going to reintroduce our pig friend and do a reverse of that image, but follow those templates and follow this template. So here he is. And in this case, this structure, I have the content targeted to be at the top as opposed to the bottom. And because it reads left to right as opposed to right to left, being on the different side, I have some actual nice freedom because of how words break on a page. So when you're designing with content on the right, it's always right justified. You can put a line down here and it's straight. But on the left side, it's kind of zigzagged and jagged. So I have more opportunity to design around objects on the page. In the future, we'll have lines that we can actually draw around, but browsers don't support that right now. So just looking at base HTML here and CSS. So now we look at this guy, and even though the pig's kind of in a weird place, we could play with it more. It still looks like it was kind of meant to be that way. And no matter what device I'm at, it looks like it was designed to be that way.
What do you mean by like there'll be lines you can design text around?
CSS has clipping for text.
So you can like make a curve and have something
similar to like publications.
Okay.
It's kind of cheesy, and I wish things like that weren't coming to the web, but I'm sure it'll be abused really nicely. All right, so looking at the Photoshop document, at the bottom right, you can see it has my asset template guide, so I have those different zones that I have. And then here's my image. So now we're going to fix that little finger, as Tim called them, 2 little hot dogs, sticking out behind. So I'm just going to nudge it over to make sure that it's inside that green zone and goes outside that yellow zone because it didn't work inside here. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that it has that little clip there. So I'm just going to nudge it so it works the right way. I could play with some of the scaling sizes. I could add some additional things here, but this is just for demo purposes. So now if I remove this and then save it out, I've now fixed that issue at that one random size. So it was only for like 10, 20 pixels, but I want to make sure that it looks right no matter which browser I'm using, no matter what size I'm using. So pay attention. So right there, it's been fixed. It's very close. I could play with it more, but I don't have that layering issue anymore.
So do you have like an asset template guide per image?
Per structure?
Per structure.
When he's saying structure, he means
Yeah, so
That would be a structure at the top. That
Okay.
would be a structure.
Okay.
yeah, modular design patterns as a whole.
Okay.
So looking at something else that you can do in Photoshop, as Tim talked about earlier, you can use smart objects, and we keep saying Photoshop. There's other tools out there that you can use, definitely like Sketch, but just kind of keeping it old school with Photoshop. So here is a listing of multiple structures that I've created under targeted devices. So from the left to the right, it's a desktop, tablet, mobile phone. And these are smart objects listing out the different asset template guides for every single structure on my site.
This is really where it becomes a lot more powerful for the designer. When responsive first started kind of coming to the forefront, there was always an issue of the designer potentially having to design out for all these different resolutions. So we're looking for a way of getting around that, and this is a nice solution where you design for one resolution, and through smart objects, it refills throughout these other resolutions, so you can start making tweaks with one document, but for all these different resolutions and landscapes.
Yeah, and you don't actually have to save out anything. It's just using smart objects in a creative way to look at how I can nudge this piece around, how I can see this design at every single targeted aspect or every device that I want to be using. So it takes the complete guessing away and allows me to kind of visualize it without even having to save out an image or see it in Photoshop. And there's also there's probably some better ways that you could attack the smart object, but I did this around this piece 10:30 last night, so it was a quick put together.
It's really
This is before I had dinner, so that's not a joke either. Yeah, so that's kind of the demo as a whole. Do you guys have any questions, especially while I have this guy up here?
What about browsers? Kind of browsers.
So this would work across any browser as long as it's a browser that supports responsive, so IE9 and greater than. Depending on the complexity of your structure is up to you, and then doing cross-browser tracking as you're doing it. But nothing that we're talking about. We're just talking about images for the web, which have been available since '95, actually earlier. So
ASCII art, so like earlier.
So, say that like the designer and the developer aren't the same person, would you still put those green and purple squares around an image and then give it to the developer and assume that like they know how to do the breakpoints and everything so everything lines up?
this is intended for it not to be the same person as a whole, and even if it is the same person, it can help out. It's kind of a rare case that you would have designer and developer be the same person. Even if they had the same skill set, they should never have that same role on a project. And just because of one side's always going to win over the other. But in the case of this, you would probably not want to save out that template around it unless you were having an issue visually that you wanted to identify, like this is where I want to move it around. The important thing is keeping the full image aspect ratio to that image and making sure you're saving it out and you're not trimming off the transparent like PNG pieces as a whole.
And where these, where the asset template guide marks are coming from are from screen grabs from the actual browser. So this structure would be made using code, and then there'd be a screen grab of that particular resolution that would then be dropped in Photoshop. So these marks weren't made in Photoshop; they were from a screen grab.
Yeah. So as I showed in that demo, like those black and red lines before I added in the image, that's where the marks came on the image. So all I needed to do was put a placeholder image and then figure out where do I want to adjust the image. And I also knew that my offset of my content on top of my image was a negative 200 margin left pixels, 200 pixels margin left negative 200 pixels, as well as I was being offset of the image 300 pixels. So I knew my first vertical line, which would be my first crop, would be at 300 pixels, and then my overlaying of my yellow text is going to be on top of it would be the negative 200 pixels from the far right of it. Probably sounded way more confusing than it was in my head.
So there's already been like significant design and development up to this point.
Yeah.
Well, there's been like the
So,
initial
like, where you
figuring out
take
the
the screen
structure and the
grab out
content. Yeah. So you've somewhat determined the general design for this particular structure. So that can be any sort of fidelity, as we kind of talked about earlier. So it could be even a sketch. And then the overall containers are created to make the structure. So that's what's really giving you the general sizing of these. And then as you're going from different breakpoints or different viewpoint ports, you're starting to define how much area you have for the bleeds and the safe area. And then once those are determined, that's when you make the screen grab, and then you start designing into these sections, opposed to designing everything, starting to just throw it in the browser and it starts breaking. So this hopefully gives you a little bit of insight into how things are going to scale at different viewpoints before going directly into the browser. And it also allows for multiple designers to be able to utilize this without getting into code, as well as just allowing you to kind of explore a little bit more than you potentially would if you were just doing it with a single typical Photoshop document that's at X resolution. You're able to see multiple resolutions all at the same time.
Wouldn't you be able to reuse that code too, basically,
Yep.
for almost every single project that you work on?
So there's two things. Yes and no. The only thing about it is, and going back to the example that we showed earlier, the flow outside of that box at the maximum width, as well as the layering on top of it, as well as the content structure width, need to kind of be consistent. Because if I had one zone up here that was like offset like 800 pixels, and then I had a little tiny text over here, and then like one was like 2, your eye wouldn't read it right. So you kind of need it to be them to kind of be consistent and play well together as individual pieces, but as a growing page. And the big thing is when you're looking at the content, especially when it gets smaller, of different zones, and it's not just talking about asset template guides, but responsive. You don't want to have one section that's like this skinny, and then one section that's like this skinny, because your eye can't really, like, and having 2 words on the line doesn't really help you out either. So, yes and no, but in reality, these are like the examples that I built out was less than like 15 minutes of actual like thinking about how to build out the asset template guide, and majority of my code, I spent more time thinking about how I was going to design it as opposed to the creation of the asset template guide and the structure. So that was, 15, 30 minutes total. And again, this also happens in the beginning of the development process, so it's iterative as a whole. And a website could have 2 different structures that are based around this, or it could have 40, but hopefully not that many. I've worked in some big projects and that have used asset template guides and similar structures of these layering, and I think I maxed out around 5, so 5 or 6.
Here is it's iterative. The designer has that first design, and then the developer goes and mocks it up, and then plays around with how it might very responsibly. Sits down with the designer and he says, "Here's what this does." And you like it, but in some place that they get back to the designer, you can then make that a more flexible template.
And because I'm recording this, I'm not going to say, but after I stop recording this, I'm going to show you an example of why this is kind of important, and someone that completely missed the mark on especially the layering effects and making things responsive. Any other questions? What? No. All right, cool. The only other slide left is just to repeat questions. So, any other questions? And then I think, did you put a thank you slide in here?
Oh, yeah.
This is where you bow. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim.